Last week, we covered the news that Anthony Fauci will be stepping down in December to spend more time staring adoringly into a mirror. And honestly, we needed more time to do Fauci and his legacy justice. And by justice, we mean giving you the truth about the man the mainstream media still celebrates as a god among men, a celebrity of on-screen science, or even as the science itself. But unlike famous doctors who save lives like Doogie Howser, JD, and most of the time House, Fauci actually deserves to be among a different crowd. Maybe more like Dr. Evil, Dr. Huxtable, or Dr. Hannibal Lecter, because he's done way more damage than all of them combined. Also, at least Hannibal was smart and helped solve crimes, because Fauci is actually just terrible, for 3 reasons. Well, 3 reasons we have time for. First, his job throughout the pandemic was to serve as the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, or NIAID, and to be chief medical advisor to the White House under President Donald Trump and then President Joe Biden. But instead, or if we're being kind at the same time, he was catapulted to the forefront of our COVID culture and turned into an overnight celebrity of the science. And my problem here is not that this happened necessarily. After all, America is obsessed with the cult of celebrity, and people are routinely pushed to the forefront of the national conversation as the face of an issue, whether they want to or not. No, my problem is that Fauci, a self-proclaimed man of science, integrity, and truth, embraced the celebrity. If anything, he fueled it. As the pandemic grew, so did his ego, getting to a point where the daily COVID briefings became a battle of who thinks they're best, Donald Trump or Anthony Fauci. A battle royale with cheese, if you will. And like ER doctors and nurses who said they were being worked way too hard during the pandemic but still had time to record fully choreographed TikToks, Fauci somehow found time in his packed schedule to push his own brand. And I'm not talking about his appearances on news outlets because that's part of his job. I'm talking about the hundreds of other media events which fall more into the bucket of public relations than informing the public. How did he have time to give lectures, attend panel discussions, give speeches? How did he have time to star in Fauci, a National Geographic documentary which was filmed in secret during an ongoing global pandemic? How did he have time to pose for photoshoot after photoshoot after photoshoot? And this was all while he was just so full of himself, even having a picture of himself on his office wall, which weirdly grows older as he gets more powerful. According to the mainstream media, Fauci was a beacon of truth shining through the foggy propaganda of the Trump administration, and then the ongoing semi-fascist MAGA crowd of the Biden era. But there's just one problem, which brings us to the second reason Fauci is just the worst. He's terrible at his job, because his job ended up being to spout self-aggrandizing platitudes to err on the side of his own safety, while also taking no responsibility for the consequences. In the early days of COVID-19, he said that it wasn't a major threat.
Dr. Fauci, coronavirus, of course, has been in the news so much. People are worried. Should they be worried? Are they worried unnecessarily? And what should they be doing?
No, I don't think people should be frightened. I mean, the risk right now, today, currently, is really relatively low for the American public, but that could change. So right now, don't worry about it. Be more concerned about influenza, which is going into a second peak for the season.
Then, almost overnight, he decided that it was. He also initially declared that Americans shouldn't wear masks.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is.
But yet again, he flipped, arguing in favor of masks, double masking, and then full-body condoms. And when he was asked why Americans weren't advised to wear masks from the start, he explained that he effectively lied to protect medical supplies.
Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who you know were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected.
Which is, let's be honest, way worse than the normal incompetence we see in the federal government. He knew he was lying, but he did it anyway, disrespecting and manipulating the American people to basically play politics. And throughout the pandemic, Fauci kept screwing up and kept claiming that it wasn't he that was wrong, it was just the science that had changed. Don't believe your lying eyes. He called for contact tracing, so the CDC doled out $631 million in April 2020, while some states spent millions of dollars developing contact tracing apps. None of it worked. He called for a complete shutdown of the economy and the closure of schools, leading to voluntary economic collapse and unemployment, let alone the mental health implications of forcing people in their homes for months on end. He dismissed calls for a nuanced or science-based approach which focused on the vulnerable. He dismissed the idea that natural immunity existed, even though he pushed that idea at one point too, and all while in private doubting the efficacy of masks and things like asymptomatic spread. But it's not even like Fauci had a stellar career until COVID-19. Under his leadership, the NIAID spent billions on defense against bioterrorist attacks, including $117 million on an anthrax vaccine that never materialized, all while critics pointed out that Fauci was distorting priorities away from understanding and fighting natural disease outbreaks like influenza. He fought for full control of the federal government response during the HIV/AIDS pandemic and spent hundreds of millions of dollars on an almost tunnel-visioned approach to fighting the then terminal illness with a vaccine. The vaccine never materialized, again, and this came at the expense of years lost researching the antiretroviral drugs we see today, which have turned HIV into a manageable condition rather than a death sentence. And in fact, AZT, the only AIDS treatment to come out of Fauci's federal government research empire, only appeared when the private sector got involved. Again, sound familiar? Oh, and he also made national headlines in the 1980s when he warned that HIV could be spread by routine close contact among family members. More medical misinformation from Fauci spreading false fear and preventing a targeted focus on those most vulnerable, but helping him get more funding. Does that sound familiar? And whether it was screwing up the federal government's response to AIDS, anthrax, or COVID-19, the deepest point of Fauci's failed legacy is simple. He helped delegitimize science itself. The fact is that Fauci is largely responsible for a growing sentiment in the country that experts aren't experts at all. According to Pew Research earlier this year, only 29% of American adults said they had a great deal of confidence in medical scientists to act in the best interests of the public, down from 40% who said this in November 2020. Gee, I wonder why. It might be because Fauci had a symbiotic relationship with the press, with journalists promising Fauci they'd give him favorable coverage. It might be because he avoided questions regarding legitimate concerns about US taxpayer dollars being used to fund gain-of-function research at the virology lab in Wuhan. The fact that we give a single dollar to our enemies is a subject for another time. It might be because despite being a man of scientific integrity, he remained utterly silent when Democrats endorsed nationwide riots in 2020, or when children were forced to wear masks, or when schools were shut because teachers' unions wanted to be paid to stay home and complain, or as vaccines were pushed on increasingly younger people despite their vanishingly small risk levels. All while Fauci rejected any criticism of authoritarian policies as ignorant anti-science propaganda. As his ego grew, he even announced that he was no longer a scientist, but the science.
So it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science.
And why? Well, it's because Fauci is a scientist second and a politician first. Yes, he's a public servant, but he's a public servant who serves himself before anyone or anything else. No one can survive for 30 seconds in DC without knowing how to play the game. You think Fauci survived decades and became a multimillionaire because he's not good at playing politics? And COVID-19 is all the proof we need. Is it a coincidence that Fauci partnered with Deborah Birx and Robert Redfield following the failed AIDS vaccine project to exploit a relationship that lasted for years, agreeing to resign if one of them was fired and promising to never disagree with each other publicly, such as refusing to acknowledge evidence that lockdowns and mask mandates weren't working? All while his objective changed depending on who was in office. Under Trump, he knew that his role was to simultaneously combat COVID-19 and the Republican administration. Under Biden, his role changed to helping the Democrat administration move on. And the mainstream media, who were part of this institutional apparatus, helped at every step along the way. Regardless of whether masks worked or didn't work, or whether any of the science changed, his constant politically helpful flip-flopping created and fueled mistrust and confusion, made worse by his arrogant sneering at the legitimate questions of frustrated American citizens whose lives were being ruined by his nonsense. But moving the goalposts was part of Fauci's entire strategy to keep himself in a position of supposed authority, saying that he changed his public viewpoint based on, quote, his gut feeling that the country is finally ready to hear what he really thinks. They think you're stupid. That's the takeaway here. They know what's best for you, even if you can't see it. And it just so happens that what's best for you is also what's best for them. How convenient. The reason Fauci is the worst is because he's indicative of everything that is wrong with our expert class. It's not about science, or truth, or understanding, but power. Our expert class is no longer populated by actual experts because they are still largely driven by the pursuit of truth. And in today's society, truth is a bad word. Instead, our experts are politicians in lab coats, people who would blow their nose on the truth if it meant more power, or more money, or more influence. And Fauci is the worst of them all. If you like that clip, subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can watch full episodes and other clips just like this one.